Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzadi. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start at the bottom of Pei Tet a bit. The reminder of Ravina bar Shila's opinion. Ravina bar Shila said that imurim, the parts that get burned on the altar of the kodashim kalim, which generally kodashim kalim, there's no laws of meila yet until once the blood is sprinkled, then the imurim, the parts that get burned on the altar, have potential to become meila, misuse of consecrated property, and at that point, they can become disqualified if they leave the temple, right? They leave the Azara boundaries because they have to stay in the Azara. Now, what Ravina bar Shila says is even before Zrikatam, the imurim, those parts that get burned on the altar, cannot leave the temple, or the Azara boundaries. Okay, that's what he says. And if they do, it disqualifies the offering. So, right, the imurim are disqualified. So now we have Lema Kittanai. We're now going to suggest that perhaps it's a machloket tanaim what he says. Okay, and now we're going to prove it. Imurei kodashim kalim shiatzu lefnei zrikatamim. This is exactly our case, except we're going to assume right now they left the Azara, which according to Shila, that would disqualify them, and then they were brought back in. That's what we're assuming this machloket is about. Rabbi Eliezer or Mil ein moalim behem. If later then the blood is sprinkled after they were brought back in, there's no me'ila anymore because they were already disqualified. That sounds exactly like Ravina bar Shila. And there's no laws of pigul notar and tame relevant, right? If you have the pigul notar and tame, right, you have a thought while you're doing the blood, that doesn't affect these imurim because the imurim were already disqualified. Rabbi Akiva Omer moalim behem v'chayavim aleim mishum pigul notar v'tame. Rabbi Akiva says, what do you mean? All of that applies. Me'ila, their potential for me'ila, because they weren't disqualified when they went out. They weren't yet, there was no Zrika Dam yet. So if you brought them out, brought them back in, it's fine. As long as they're inside when the Zrika Dam happens, when the sprinkling of the blood, then potential for me'ila, their potential, you could be chayav for pigul notar and tameh if you eat them when there was a pigul machshava before, right? Or they get left over beyond given time, or they were impure. All that could basically, right, make you obligated because he doesn't think they're disqualified by just taking them out as long as you brought them back in, as long as all that happens before the blood is sprinkled. So now, it didn't really say that this was all when it was taken out and brought back in. All it said was they went out. But the Gemara assumes, my lab dehadar eilenu pligi. And then isn't the machloket when you brought them back in? And then it would make sense because then baha pligi. Here's the machloket. Mar savar mi pasa biyotze, and Mar savar lo mi pasa biyotze. And then they argue over exactly what Ravina bar Shila said. Rabbi Eliezer holds exactly like Ravina bar Shila. Once you take them out, they're disqualified. So none of the rest is relevant anymore because they're already disqualified. The sprinkling of the blood is not going to have any effect on them. And the other one says, no. They're not disqualified by Yotze, and therefore if you bring them back in and they happen to be inside with time is rikatam, then they can become potential for me'ila, right? Then everything goes the way it's supposed to. Again, the way it's supposed to means they shouldn't become pico, but if they were to become pico, they could, right? All that. Now, Rav Papa, no. That's not the machloket here. You misunderstood the case. It's not talking about if you brought it back in. Bahadar Ailinu Kulam Pligi. Everyone agrees if you brought it back in. Of course, everyone agrees against Ravina bar Shila that if you took them out and brought them back in, nothing happened. Okay, because the Zrikat Dam hadn't happened yet. You didn't ruin anything. And therefore, they would all hold like Rabbi Akiva in that case. In other words, with what Rabbi Akiva said, Chayavim Mishum Ila, Pigul Notar, all that. Okay? It's potential from Ila, you could, all that. Now, what's the machloket then? Hadar ba'itinu abarai pligi. The machloket is while they're outside. If they're outside when the blood is sprinkled, and then it's a totally different machloket here. Baha pligi. This is their machloket. Mar savar ein zrika moelet liyotze. Rabbi Eliezer says the zrika that happens inside has no effect on what's going outside. If the imurim are outside, they're completely disconnected from the korban at that point. And whatever you do inside has no bearing outside. And therefore, what normally happens is you sprinkle the blood and the imurim become potential for me'ila. And if you were mefagel, we had a thought while you were sprinkling the blood that you were going to do something at the wrong time, well, that would affect the imurim as well. But since they're outside, they're disconnected and it has no effect. And that's Rabbi Eliezer. Umar Savars, and Rabbi Akiva says, what do you mean? What's the difference if it's outside or inside? It's still obviously connected. It was part of the sacrifice. If you mess up on the blood, you mess up on that as well. Or you sprinkle the blood, then it creates this capability of becoming susceptible to me'ila. because it is affected by it. Okay, and then this machloket has nothing to do with anything. So that sounds like a good explanation to say, okay, this really isn't a machloket tanaim about the argument really is about Rav or Shila said. The problem is that Rav Papa said their machloket is specifically when it's outside, but inside everyone would agree that it's definitely going to be part of the korban and the zrikat dam is going to affect it. They say that in a very parallel case. Okay, we're going to talk about Shavuot. Shavuot, what we're going to see is another machloket, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, and a comment of Rav Papa about which case do they argue about. And it's going to be the same thing where something's out and something's in, and does it affect it or not? So it's going to sound the same thing. And in that case, though, Rav Papa is going to say the machloket is specifically outside and not inside. They weren't brought back inside. What's the case? And that's going to raise difficulty on the way he explained this machloket. So there we have a korban on Shavuot, which is called the shtei alechem. Okay, it's brought, you bring two kibsei atzeret. Okay, these are shalmei atzeret and shlamim, and then you bring bread along with it. What if you brought the bread outside and the blood wasn't sprinkled yet? So it's the same thing because the bread in the end is going to be eaten, but at this point it's right, and it's going to be kodashim, but at this point it's not allowed to be eaten, right? It's not, doesn't have anything until you sprinkle the blood. The blood has to be sprinkled first. So now, what if they were outside when the blood was sprinkled? So Rav Papa hudam, or you took them out at some point. You're not supposed to take them out, but again, until the blood is sprinkled, it's not really right of the animal. This bread is not relevant yet. So Rav Papa hudamar b'deitnu abarai. Now the whole question is here. What the real issue is, it's not meila and all that. What if you had a pigul machshava by the siirim, by the kfasim, the kibsei atzeret? You had a pigul thought. Does that mess up the bread? So if the bread was always inside, the bread's connected to the sacrifice, then of course it's going to be disqualified. Okay, the bread's going to be pigul as well. But they have a machloket about a case where maybe the bread's not going to be pigul. Now the question is, what's the case that they argue? So Rav Papa says, and it's the same people, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. If it's outside, nobody disagrees, meaning they all think that if the bread is outside, when you had this pigul machshava inside about the blood of the offering of the animal, it has no bearing on the bread because bread was outside at the time, totally disconnected. But if you brought it back inside, that's the machloket. Hanim, okay, so now, then they have a machloket. If you brought it back inside, is it now connected, and therefore it'll be pigul, and if you eat that bread, you're chayv karet? Or, again, this was while you were doing the blood of the kvasim, of that offering, you had a pigul machshava about whatever, right? I'm going to eat the meat beyond its time or burn the meat beyond its time. And the meat was inside, but it had been brought outside. So one opinion says, oh, it's brought outside. It's already, right, disqualified and not connected anymore, so there's no pigul by the bread. The other opinion says, no, you brought it back in, so it's back in. Okay, now, if that's the case, don't you think the argument is also, in our case, about, well, you brought it back in? So they say no. And then if the argument by us is back inside, then that would be exactly the machloket. Do they hold like Ravina bar Shila or not? Back to what we suggested originally. But they say, no. These two are not the same, even though it sounds like they're the same, because one is the blood, and does that have effect on imurim that were taken outside and brought back in? But it's not the same at all. Why? Because the bread is very different. The bread is an external thing that is brought to go along with this sacrifice. It wasn't part of the animal's agreement like the imurim were, that the blood came from the animal and the imurim came from the animal, right? So, aval imurim de gufe de zivchu b'dinei abarai pligi. In other words, the bread is already not so connected in the first place. You're connecting it, but the connection between that and the blood is weak. So therefore, outside, for sure, once it's brought outside, we're going to assume these aren't connected at all, and everyone's going to agree. And inside, there's going to be this machloket. But when it comes to the imurim, which were part of it, we can say that outside, there's still a question. Maybe they're still connected. Just because they're outside, they came from the korban itself. So in which case, that didn't raise any difficulty. The fact that Rav Papa said that there and this here, two totally different things, and we can accept that as an answer, and we can move on. And basically, that was all to reject the suggestion that we thought that maybe there's a machloket tanaim about Ravina bar Shila. Okay. In the end, by the way we explained it is that nobody agrees with Ravina bar Shila in the end, right? Neither of these tanaim. Ofot kudmi. Now we're back to the Mishnah where it talks about who came first. So we're back to the original Mishnah. Now we're going in depth into different parts. The birds come before, right? Any bird sacrifices come before mincha, meal offerings. So the Gemara suggests, Adrabah, menachot kodmot, kin yeshem b'tzibur b'yachid. But meal offerings are offered public and right, individual. But right, there's, let's say, the Minchara Omer, which is a public one for the whole community. But birds are only individual offerings. So wouldn't you think the Menachot maybe should come first? Still, we're going to go with the birds because the birds have blood and offerings of the blood, which is obviously much more significant than a meal offering. Minchat Chote comes before a Minchat Nedava. So a sin mincha comes, that's if you're do the Olav Yored, if you can't afford, right, the animals, you can't afford the birds, you go to the meal offering. That's going to come before the Minchat Nedava voluntary one. So now they say, why don't you say Adrabah, Minchat Nedava Kodemet? Shekein Tunash Shemen Ulevona. It has oil, it has frankincense. Whereas the meal offering for the sinner is as plain as possible because it's a sinner offering. We don't want it to be lavish and nice and good. So we do it very simple. And therefore, you would think the Shemen and Levona makes the voluntary one much nicer. We're always going to go with sins. The sin one atones for a sin. That always gets precedence over everything else. Now they have a question. We're going to try to answer it from a few sources. Two sources, we're not going to succeed. What about the mincha of Sotah? I hope I said Sotah and I didn't say the wrong thing. Minchat Sotah. So the mincha of Sotah. Now, the mincha of Sotah comes because Sotah maybe did a sin, but we're not even sure if she did a sin, and it's really coming. She brings this mincha offering from barley. It comes really to figure out, really her husband brings it, I believe. I think it's more he brings it, but maybe she brings it, I forget. But the point is, comes with a Sotah. And it's there to figure out, is she a sinner or not? Did she sleep with the other man or did she not? So it's sort of for a sin, but sort of not for a sin. It's not coming to atone. So it doesn't have that same logic as the Minchat Chote, which, it's toning. That puts it in top priority. So here's our deliberation. It needs oil, frankincense, whereas the Sotah one is also a plain one, doesn't have all that stuff. But maybe it's coming to figure out that someone sinned. Maybe that takes precedence. So Tashma, first attempt to answer the question. Why? Right now, here you have the Minchat Chote comes before Minchat Nedava. That's our Mishnah. What are we going to derive from here? Minchat Chotehu dekadma leMinchat Nedava. HaMinchat Sotah lo. But it doesn't say Minchat Sotah, so it must mean the Minchat Chote comes before Nedava, but not a Sotah. So the Gemara says, no. Mi katane mipnei shi mechaperet. Now notice what it said. Why does a Minchat Chote come first? Not because it atones, which would have excluded the Sotah, but mipnei shi ba'al chet katane. It says because it comes for a sin. Now, if it's coming for a sin, actually Sotah fits in the same category. So you could say Minchat Chote and Minchat Sotah. Hanami, right? And because Hanami ba'al chet, it also comes for a sin. Second attempt. Tashma, now this is a trickier one because this one doesn't say anything at all, okay? Or it says something, but you'll see. Zo kodemet lezo. This one comes before that one. Now, we don't know which this one is and which one that one is. Shazo ba min achitim v'zo ba min aseorim. This one comes from wheat and this one comes from barley. Now, the Sotah comes from barley, so we assume that one's the Sotah. Which one's the other one that comes from wheat? There happens to be both the Nedava and the Minchat Chote come from wheat. So that's why it's a little tricky here. So now they're going to suggest, my lab, Minchat Nedava, Minchat Sotah. We're going to assume it's the Minchat Nedava comes before the Minchat Sotah, and that's wheat and that's barley. So they say, no, you could say the same thing, Minchat Chote, Minchat Sotah. Since the Minchat Chote is also wheat. You could say that comes before that, and we don't have a good answer. They say, no. Why do we think it's Nedava? Because typically, the Hamachaperet, the Halomachaperet, if it was the sinner over the Sotah, it would have said, because this one atones and that one doesn't atone. It doesn't say that. It's because this is wheat and that's barley. So that must prove that it's not the Minchat Chote because they had a better thing to say. To which the Gemara rejects and says, what do you mean? Elamai, Minchat Nedava. If you want to say Nedava comes first, you have a different reason than wheat and barley. You could say, typically, Dizotu Nashem and Ulevana, Vizoinatu Nashem and Ulevana. You could say the Nedava comes first because that has oil and frankincense and the Minchat Sotah doesn't. So that proves basically either which way something's missing. In other words, Either which way, they gave one reason out of a potential two reasons. Maybe there are even more differences, but the point is the fact that we said this and not in a mechaperet, and that is mechaperet, that doesn't prove anything because it could have also said it. Each one had two options and it took one. And that one is actually could work for Nadava, could work for Minchat Chotei. And therefore, we don't really know where Sotah holds when it comes to Minchat Nadava. Again, it's obvious it's going to come after Minchat Chotei because that's atones and that doesn't, but we don't know about it, what the order of precedence is between a voluntary and a Sotah Mincha. Okay, next category. This is the more longer part of today's sugya, a little more complicated. Chatara of kodemet le'olata of. There's many times where we bring two birds. Usually it's when we can't afford to bring more, right? There are a few offerings for just two birds anyway, but we have the Olav Yored, where you either bring as we said before, either one animal for a sin offering or two birds, one for Ola, one for Chatat. And that's what we're saying. The Chatat comes before the Ola. And there's also cases, a Yoledet, we're going to get to this, where you bring, actually it's a little different. You bring an animal for an Ola and a bird for a sin offering, a Chatat. And then if you can't afford it, you switch the animal for a bird. So you switch, instead of an animal for a burnt offering, you bring a bird for a burnt offering. And then that's brought with the other bird that you were anyway going to bring, which was a sin offering. It's a little bit different. So anyway, they're saying the Chatara of comes before the Olata of. So Menani Mile, where do we get this from? So where does this come from? They say, I just want to check one thing in the Mishna. Right, okay. So now the Gemara brings a braita. Menani Mile, where do we get it from? Ditano Rabbanan, there's a braita that says, V'kriv et asher l'chatat rishona. We're now in the Olav Yored, in the sliding scale offering, where again, instead of the animal, you're going to bring two birds. If you can't afford the two birds, you bring the mincha, but that's not interesting right now for us. We want to be on the two birds, and one is Ola, one is chatat, and it says very explicitly there, you sacrifice the chatat rishona. But why do you need that pasuk? Why not? Don't you need to know the sin offering comes first? Well, no, because in Talmud Lomar, what's it going to tell you? If it's going to tell you that it comes first. It says later, two psukim later, okay, we're in Vayikra chapter 5, verse 8, and then verse 10. Verse 10 it says, and the second one you bring is an Ola. So then we know the second one's an Ola. So why don't you say the first is a Chatat? Or say the opposite, right? Why do you need the second one if you know the first? Either which way, there's no reason to say that, both of them. So they say, Ela zebana av lechol chataot shikdemu la'olah. So they say the first one is unnecessary because the first one says you do the chatat first. That comes to tell you chatat always comes first. So now they're going to say, right, so zebana av lechol chataot shikdemu la'olah habaot imahen. Now they say not only bein chatat ha'of la'olah ha'of, not only if it's two birds and there's one olah, one chatat, Bein chatat be'ema lo'olat be'ema. It's also going to be a sin offering of an animal over a burnt offering of an animal. And afilu, even chatat of lo'olat be'ema. That's fascinating. Even a bird sin offering is going to come before a burnt animal offering. Now Rashi says we're not talking about you happen to have two korbanot, one's a bird and one's an animal. No way. The sin offering is not going to come before the olah, even though some people do think this means that. Rashi says we're talking about a case like a yoledet, where you have the ola is an animal and the chatat and the bird is a chatat. So you're going to have these go as a pair. When they go as a pair, the chatat comes first. That's what he's saying. When they're a pair, when you bring an animal with a bird, and the bird is the sin offering and the animal is a burnt offering, the sin offering is going to go first, even though it's a bird. Okay, that's what Rashi says. Now, the Gemara is now going to say, okay, they're going to go back and say, these three, where do we get these from? Hilkach, therefore, it's not really the right word therefore, but they said therefore, chatada of, lo'olata of, they're kind of summarizing. Chatada of, where do we get these three categories from? So there's going to be three psukim we're going to learn it from. Chatada of comes before olata of mi ve'et hasheni, okay, because it says the second one is ola, so that's a case where there's two birds, so that's where we're going to learn the two birds. Then chatat be'ema lo'olat be'ema. How do you get the animal over animal? It's going to be a sin offering goes first. Midi Rabbi Rachmana. That's a pasuk that comes from we saw in yesterday's daf and the Bamidbar Chet Yuchet about the Leviim where they bring animals, and it says there asat hachad chatat et hachad ola. And the chatat comes before the ola. There you see chatat comes before ola when it's two animals. What about the third? The bird comes before the animal when the bird is chatat and the animal's ola. Well, that they get from chatat of lola be'ema mizeh bana'av, from the binyan av of the rishonah, right? Do the chatat first. That builds a paradigm even when it's an animal. Okay, so that was a summary. Now we're going to bring three difficulties against this, what we just said. Okay, three. First one, Tashma, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol makom shenitchafa chatat kodemet. V'kan ola kodemet. We're going to compare three cases where you're going to bring a chatan, you're going to bring the chatat and the ola, and you're going to have a two bird offerings, or something else, you'll see. And, right, it's also all birds, I think, and the chatat always comes first. But they're going to say there's an exception where the yoledet is different. And the yoledet, it's not that way. And the yoledet, the ola is going to come first. And we're going to compare like three categories here. So, if you flip a chatat with something else, like the korban olav yored, instead of a chatat, you bring two birds. So you have an animal chatat, you flip it for two birds, right? Because you can't afford it. The chatat comes first, because then you have a chatat that becomes a chatat and an ola. The chatat's going to come first. But kan ola kodemet, but with the yoledet, where you have right there, you don't actually switch the chatat for two birds. You actually switch an ola for one bird for an ola. So there, the ola is going to come first. Second case, komakom shaba'al chet chatat kodemet. When it comes for a sin, which is like the ola v'yored, also, right, they're just talking about categories. They're really all referring to the ola v'yored, but sliding scale offering. But the point is they're talking about different concepts about it. It comes for a sin. That's why the chatat comes first, because it's atoning. But kan in the yoledet, ola kodemet. The yoledet is bringing a sin offering, but not because she did a sin. In fact, there's a whole question, right? Maybe she took a vow that she'll never have children during childbirth or something, but really there's no good reason as to why she's bringing a sin offering. I mean, obviously good reason, but it's hard to figure out because it's not really a sin. It's for some other reason. The chatat actually comes for other reasons sometimes. But that's why. So it's not coming to atone. The ola comes first. And komakom sheshnayim ba'im tacha chatat kodemet. V'kan ola kodemet. When two come in place of one chatat, where we have instead of the chatat and the ola v'yoreh, we bring two birds. Then the chatat's going to go first. But in the case of the birds that's switched in the yoledet case, the bird is switched for an ola, and it's only 1 for 1. It's not 2 for 1. You don't get two birds in place of one sin offering, so the ola is going to go first. Now, what do you see from here? It sounds like it's not only when it, right? Why does it, he's saying the ola gets switched for the ola, and that's why the ola is going to come first, because the ola anyway was supposed to come first. What was the ola supposed to come first? When it was an ola and a sin offering, the ola was supposed to come first. And that also is clear from the psukim, because the order was keves l'ola and of l'chatat. The keves comes first. You bring the animals as an offering, and then the bird as a sin offering. So that takes precedence. And that seems very clear from this source that the ola is going first. And that's a case that we were talking about before, that specifically a chatat and an ola that come together. The chatat of the bird goes first, even though it's with an animal. So that seems to go against what we said. Amarava, you didn't understand. Lemikra kedima katuf. Just the pasuk said it goes first. In fact, there it's in two places it says it goes first by the yoledet. First it says the keves laola and then the bird for the chatat. It also says that when you switch it for two birds, you do the ola and then it says, it doesn't say first, but it says echad laola ve'echad lechatat, and ola comes first. So that's just in the pasuk it comes first. It doesn't mean that it's actually brought first on the altar, and therefore this doesn't disagree. What they're saying here in this bright is, it was mentioned first, but it doesn't mean that it's actually being brought first. Okay, next. Tashma. Parim kodmim le'elim, ve'elim kodmim le'kfasim, kfasim le'sirim. So bulls come before rams, rams come before sheep, sheep come before goats. Now, what's the topic here? So the Gemara says, my love, is this not talking about dechag, for a holiday? And if it's for a holiday, you might remember the sirezim, what are they for? The sin offering, and they're last on this list. So that would be a problem, because sin offering should come first. This is against the animal, right? Animal chatat should always come first. So they say, lo lenidava, these must be voluntary ola offerings. And that's why the sirim come last. Now, why they come last? Well, we're going to explain. Parim kodmim le'elim shekenet rebu b'nisachim. they have more libations. If you remember, we say this in our davening, shlosha esronim lapar, you bring three esronim of solet for the meal offering that goes with the bull one, two for the ayil and one for the keves. Doesn't even talk about the seir. I'm not sure if the seir doesn't have it all. I'm guessing they don't have it all. Anyway, the point is the parim go before the elim because they have more nesachim. You bring more, a bigger meal offering. Chen elim lakfasim, and also by the wine, by the way, it's more. And the rams come before the sheep for the same reason. Kfasim come before the seirim. Shekenit robuva aliyah, because the tail of the sheep gets burned on the altar, and it doesn't for the goat. There is no, right? The tail is very small, it doesn't get burned. So here you see, it's all voluntary offerings. It has nothing to do, these are all korbanot olah. They have nothing to do at all with our topic of a sin offering. And that's because we thought they were talking about the sin offering on the holidays, where the serizim is a sin offering, but that's not what we're talking about. Third difficulty, Tashma, Par Kohen Mashiach Kodem Lepar Elim Devar Shel Tzibur. Okay, those are both sin offerings. Okay, but the Par Kohen Mashiach comes first. Par Halim Devar Shel Tzibur Kodem Lepar Avodah Zarah. Now the Par Avodah Zarah is an Ola, so that also fits. Chatat before Ola. But if the community follows the Beit Din, an erroneous ruling, and does Avodah Zarah, they have to bring a par for an Ola and a seir for a chatat. Now here's the tricky part, because par Avodah Zarah Kodem L'Seirei Avodah Zarah. The par of the Ola comes before the seirim of Avodah Zarah, and they're brought for sin offering. So here you see, burnt comes before sin in animals. Problem. Da'af agav de par Avodah Zarah Ola L'Seirei Avodah Zarah chatat. Right? In other words, and that comes the Gemara and says, even though the par is an Ola and the seirim is a chatat, so that disproves your theory. So they say, what do you mean? You can prove it from the beginning. Paralim devar shel tzibur kodem lepar avodah zarah. Right? There you have the paralim devar shel tzibur, which is a sin offering, comes before the par avodah zarah, which is an ola. Well, the reason why you didn't say that, and here's going to be another kind of answering with them raising a difficulty. Bechan mina miha lo ka'amrinan dechatat kadma. The reason why they didn't bring in the beginning part is because that's a par and that's a par. When it's the same animal, for sure the chata comes first. Ki ka'amrinan betrei mine. Betrei mine, and my difficulty was, and this is returning the difficulty back to its place, eshkachan ola de kadma lechatat. In other words, you have this case where you have two different animals, a par and a seir. The par is an ola, the seir is a chatat, and you're going to bring the ola before the chatat. And that's the problem, because that's what you were talking about before, that a chatat of an animal is going to come before a burnt offering of an animal. And here you see the opposite. So we're going to have an answer here. Two answers. Amr b'marav and Mishmei Rav Bar Mary. In Israel, they said, in the name of Rav Bar Mary, chatat avodah zarah chaser aleph lechatat ktiv. This is an exception to the rule. Why is it an exception to the rule? Because the word chatat appears when it says in the chatat of the serizim echad lechatat, in the pasuk about the sirei avodah zarah in Bamidbar chapter 15, verse 24, it's missing an aleph. From there you can darshan, this chatat is different. It's going to come, first of all, in the pasuk it says, bring a par ben bakar le'olah, that's mentioned first. And then it says, skipping a few words, and a serizim echad lechatat, and the chatat is missing an aleph, that's his drasha. This is a unique exception. And then it's not a question because this is a unique halacha. Ravina also says it's unique halacha from a different word in that pasuk. Ravina amar kamishpat ktiv behu. Kamishpat means according to the rules, which means according to the way it's written. So because the par comes first in the pasuk, that's how you do it because of the word kamishpat. Kamishpat tells you it has to be done in this order. And that's, let's just read the pasuk. You bring par ben bakar chad la'olah, l'reach nichach la'Hashem. Umin chato v'nisko kamishpat. You have to do the meal offerings and the libations according to their rules. So anyway, the point is the word according to the rules are there. That means do the par first, then do the chatat, which comes right after. Usirizim echad chatat. Okay, so either which way you darshan, either from the word chatat that's missing an aleph or kamishpat, like it says, that's an exception to the rule. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. If already you're using this drasha of kamishpat, I can answer the previous question in a different way. The previous question was, right, the seirim come last in that list, and we thought it was the chagim, and that was the difficulty. We said, oh no, it must be nidava. But now we can go back and say it is the chagim, but what? Also, the word kimishpatam appears by the chagim. Afilu tema parim dechag nami kimishpatam ktibu. It says there, minchatam v'niskem kimishpatam, la parim, la ilim, la fasim, b'mischaram kimishpatam. There's an order because it says it has to be done in this order. And the serizim is always last there. in the holidays. So there we have a different answer. We could maybe say the previous one was the chagim, but we have a way to answer. Okay, that ends that section. Now we get to another question. Here we have a funny situation because we have three things. Chatara of, an olat behema, and a maasir. Now we have a problem because what? Tikdom chatara of. If we say first do the chatara of, what's the problem? Maasir to kadim laf. You have chatara of, and you have maasir. The maasir of the animal is supposed to go first because it's an animal and that goes before a bird. But remember, we said the chatat of the oaf comes before the olat behema that goes with it, but the maasir has nothing to do with it. The maasir should go first. If you put the maasir first, though, what's the problem? You also have olat behema. Now, what's first in olat behema or maasir? Olat behema. So the olat behema should go first. What's the problem? If you're going to put the olat behema first, you're going to have to put the chatat before it, and then the maasir is going to be at the end. And maasir is not supposed to be at the end after, right? It should come before the bird. So that's going to be our circular reasoning here. So again, tikto chatata ha'of. If you put the chatata ha'of first, there's maasir that should go first. Likto maasir, if you put maasir first, ika olat behema the kadmalat. The olat behema is supposed to go first. Tikto olat behema, ika chatata ha'of the kadmalat. If you start with the olat behema, you're going to have chatata ha'of before that. So either which way, you're going to keep going around in circles. So again, we're going to have two answers, one in Israel, one in Babylonia. Hachatir gamu in Israel, they said, in Babylonia, they said, min zevach adif. Better to go with the sacrifice first, start with the maaser, then go to the chatat of the animal, and then to the ola. B'ma'arava amre ayla ba ola behema b'chatat ha'of v'agba ha'agbata mi-maaser. The ola behema has to go before the maaser because that's kodashim. So what are we going to do? Start with chatat ha'of, go to olata behema, and then go to the maaser. Okay, new Mishna. Kol chataot shebetorah kodmot la'ashamot chutz me'asham mitzorah. Chatat always comes before Asham, except for Asham Mitzorah. It's a unique halacha. Why? It's trying to purify this leper. So we're going to actually take that first. That's going to go over atonement for sin. Remember, he's also stuck outside the camp, right? We want to bring him in as quickly as possible. Every Asham has to be, the animal has to be within its second year. And it has to be brought with 2 shkalim, which in the Gemara is coins, is actually 2 slaim. Chutzmi, which is actually 4 shkalim. Okay, that's the different shkalim in the time of the Gemara is not the same as shkalim in the Torah. Chutzmi asham nazir v'asham mitzorah. Shehem, okay, they're different for those 2 rules. Shehem ba'im b'nei shnatan, they have to be within their first year. Ve'em ba'im b'kesef shkalim, and they don't have a minimum amount of what they have to be. Now, you don't have to spend a certain amount of money on the animal. Okay, now we go back to all these rules. All the rules we said about which animal you sacrifice first, same rules for kodmin b'achilatan, which one you eat first. Shlamim shel emesh u shlamim shel yom. Here are some other rules about what you eat. What if you have shlamim from yesterday and you have shlamim from today? Which one do you eat first? Shel emesh kodmin l'shel yom. The ones from yesterday you eat first because, what's the problem? They're going to get ruined soon, right? By nighttime you won't be able to eat them. Shlamim shel emesh v'chatat asham shel hayom. What if you have shlamim from yesterday and chatat nashim from today? Now, on the one hand, the shlamim are old, so you would say eat that first. On the other hand, they're all going to be disqualified by nighttime, and chatat nashim usually take precedence in general over shlamim. So they say, shlamim shel emesh kodmim divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says go with the shlamim first. But chachamim omrim chatat kodem epnei kodashim. Chatat goes first because it's kodashim. Right? This is only if it's up against the shlamim from yesterday. If it's up against shlamim from today, the chatat's going to go first, for sure. V'kulan kohanim r'sha'im l'shanot b'achilatan. The kohanim could eat them any way they want. Lochlan tzluyim u'shlukim u'v'shalim. They can roast them. They can cook them for a very long time in water. They cook them regular, boil them. Latei l'tochan tavlei chulim v'tavlei truma. Divrei Rav Shimon. We quoted this a while ago. Right? You can put in spices of truma, spices of non-truma, because when Rabbi Shimon's not worried, oh, well, the truma is going to get bad in another day when this meat can't be eaten anymore. He's not worried about that. Rabbi Meir is worried about that. And Rabbi Meir Omer, lo yitechen l'tochan tavlei truma, shelo yaviyat truma lidei psul. We don't want to create a situation where you're going to have to throw away truma, burn it, not throw it away. You have to burn it because it's truma, right? It's now disqualified. The kodashim have to be burned, so the truma is going to be burnt with it. We don't want to create a situation like that, so you can't put spices of truma in your kodashim meat. Ibayl. Now they ask a question. We'll end with this question for today. Tadir umikudash ezmem kodem. we have this principle, things that happen frequently take precedence. We also have this principle, things that are higher sanctity go first. What if you have one that's common and one that's right, one that's more frequent and one that's more sanctified? Which one goes first? Tadir kodem mishum de tadir, or dilma mekudash kodem de kaddish. Okay, it doesn't really explain the question any more than you already figured it out. But does the tadir go first because it's more common, or does the sanctified one go first because it's more sanctified? Rashi gives some examples here, like the blood of the korban olah with the blood of the sin offering of a musaf, like the sirizim, because that right, the korban tamid comes every day. On the other hand, the chatat's supposed to take precedence. Okay, that's one example. There's a bunch of other ones, but anyway, we'll stop here and we'll get back to this after in tomorrow's class. So what do we have? We started with the issue of Ravina bar Shila. Is there a machloket tanaim about that? The imurim that yatsu before his rikatam, he says they're disqualified. Is there a machloket tanaim about it, or is it possible none of these tanaim agree with him? That's what we ended up kind of saying, or at least it looks that way. Then we had some discussions about the ofot. Really, why did they come before the mincha? Why does mincha chote come before the mincha nedava? Maybe you could say otherwise. Why does that answer win out over that one? The mincha sotah and the mincha nedava, we didn't have an answer for. We tried to find two sources that could prove it. We weren't successful. We did the chatada oaf, which is before. It comes before an olata oaf. It comes before olat be'ema, and a chatat be'ema comes before olat be'ema. And then we prove what are the three sources for the three things, three categories, and then we brought three difficulties against this, but answered up all the questions. From there, we got to the new Mishna, which was all about, also some exceptions to the rule of Asham. Right? Chata comes before Asham other than the Mitzorah. Other exceptions, Mitzorah and the Nezir are different than the other Ashamim for both which kind of, what age the animal is, and is there a minimum amount required to spend on it? We actually saw the source for the whole minimum, kesef, erkacha, and all that. We saw that previously in the Masachet. And then we did what about which food, right? What do you eat first? Okay, same rules as what you sacrifice first. But then we talked about some other unique cases. How do you figure out which one to eat before which one? And with that, and then we ended with this machloket about bringing things to the Beit Psul. And then we ended with this question about tadir and mikudash, which one comes first? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.